Or for me, is gender even an identity? And I realize that it really isn't. For me, gender is performative. For me, gender is liminal. For me, gender is a mood. Um, I specifically am not really ever a man or a woman or a being that carries an identity related to a gender. I am a being who understands gender, who lives gender, who responds to gender, who knows what gender mannerisms I have to adopt or adapt in a given situation or given setting.
Welcome to the Global Indian Podcast, the official platform for people of Indian origin. Yes, let's face it, we are everywhere. Welcome back to your weekly show where we plunge into the human experience of being a person of Indian origin, take a second look at those countries we now call home, and tackle the big conversations that we need to know about. It is a remarkable voyage of 50 shades of Indianness. Now, in this episode, we travel all the way down to Pakistan to meet with a dear friend, a stand-up comedian, a historian, a activist, and importantly, just a remarkable speaker. Now, this podcast is going to warrant a couple of things on your side. One, it is advisable you sit next to a warm, open air fire. Second, pour yourself a drink of your choice, of your measurements, and find the most comfortable seat you can have, because this is not only going to be a story that plunges into the very notion of what identity, history of our people is, but more importantly will give you a new paradigm of thinking. It is a remarkable conversation that deserves your attention. Now, if you'd like to find out more about the Global Indian Series, it couldn't be easier. Simply go to the globalindianseries.com website, where you can find out more about the entire repertoire of conversations so far. I'd also like to say a massive thank you to our supporters and sponsors, who without your help this wouldn't be possible. Companies who see the value of community and are getting involved in building this living encyclopedia about us. You'll shortly hear from them directly. I hope you enjoy this session.
My name is Chitra Stern, and I am a proud Global Indian Ambassador and CEO of Martinal Resorts and Martinal Residences. We pride ourselves on the journeys that define a community, and our developments bring people together. Did you know that over 70,000 people just like us call Portugal home? The Global Indian journey has brought people together in a meaningful way, and on behalf of all of us at Martinal, we want to thank you for joining us in these remarkable conversations. We look forward to seeing you here in Lisbon post-COVID. Have a great day.
And just move. Get up 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 and just.
First thing that I want to ask you, before I even ask you to tell me a bit about yourself, is how do you define yourself as being?
That's such an interesting question, and I love it because of how you framed it. How do you define yourself being? And I think what it does is it flips the sense of self from a perspective of identity to a perspective of state of existence. Being also brings in the idea of time. How are you, or who are you at this very moment, as opposed to who are you indefinitely. And I think why that's interesting is because it reframes the idea of identity from a perspective of the zeitgeist and how the time and the political sphere, the times that you're in, the age that you are, the experiences you have had up until now, how do you use all of them to somehow define yourself and create an idea of the self? So how do I see myself specifically as being is somebody who has a history that has been deleted, a history that has been misinformed, somebody who has to struggle or find the means or go back and dive into books to try and scourge a meaning of existence, who I am, where do I belong to, where do I come from, what is the purpose of life. All of these questions, when one has to define for themselves, they do stem from a historical context. So first and foremost, I think my state of being stems from this idea of a deletion of history. And when I say deletion of history, I do not mean a paucity of history. I don't mean a history that doesn't exist. I mean a history that has been deliberately deleted. And this is where the idea of colonization comes in. So my identity, when I look at it, is an identity, or my state of being as I define it, is a state of being that I define in a historical context, something that is not absolved from it. My sense of self or my sense of being does not stem from who I am today based on my experiences, but it's informed by a larger political, what should I call it, context, so as to speak. That it's also rooted in geography. The first layer, the layer of colonization and deletion of history, is also rooted in geography, of course, but then specifically rooted in geography. Where am I from specifically? What is the name of that area? And what does being from that area imply, or being from that area mean in terms of language, in terms of my access to resources as it was governed by the geopolitics of that area, and also the society and the socio-cultural aspects of that area. And then I think comes the third layer, is how I see my brain is organized and how I process information, how I give sense to things, or how do I indulge in the practice of meaning making. And I think it is all these three layers together that somehow influence my sense of being. One is the idea of the larger history, the time, the zeitgeist that I'm placed in. Second is based on the place or the places that I belong to and don't belong to. And the last one is how I make sense of things and how I give meaning and ascribe a meaning to things. And I think I'd like to close it off by saying, it's just like looking in the mirror. When you look in the mirror, you don't just look at yourself. You know you're looking at a mirror because there is a boundary to yourself. Like, this is where I end in the mirror, my reflection. Everything but this is not me. So when we are looking in the mirror, we are consequently or simultaneously looking at what we are and also what we aren't. What is the other? The other is the space and the background and the other objects that we see in the image, without even realizing it. So I think the sense of being is defined simultaneously by what all is reflected back onto you that you can call your own or yourself, and everything that you think is not your own and not yourself. So
absolutely, no, I agree with that. Yeah, it's what would, I suppose the second part then is, what's it like being you? Because you've got this remarkable history. You've done incredible change within Pakistan itself, but also quite, in my mind, it's a global movement, because you're saying, I'm not defined by my sexuality. I'm not defined by your version of what you think I am, how I dress, the way I act, the way I react. This is who I am. And if you get an issue with it, then you have to reflect on yourself, not me. But that mindset is very different compared to when the West has a look at queer rights in Pakistan or in India. What's it like being you?
Internally.
What's it like to be your organs or your liver or your kidney? No, you know what I mean. Socially, what's it like to be you?
What's it like to be me is to live in a perpetual state of conflict that you have to struggle to find meaning for, but when you do, it's an aha moment. When you do, it suddenly is intuitive and makes sense. What it's like to be me is to indulge in the practice of rationalizing and intellectualizing up until you dissolve in it. And that's all that remains. That is the rational sense that you ascribe to things. And then have that entire meaning be uprooted when there is a visceral or an intuitive experience that is fundamentally juxtaposed or paradoxical to the rational meaning making that I had indulged in. What is like to me is to live in the liminal, in the meaning between the lines,
Hmm.
in the subtext, and not just the overtly stated. So I think I alternate between those modes of existences. And I think one practical example that I can somehow give to materialize this abstraction that I'm indulging in right now is when in the US, when I went for my master's and somebody asked me, what are your gender pronouns? And I knew what the question meant. And I knew what the political baggage this question carried, because it wasn't just a simple question of he, she, they, them. It was a question of how should I see you? What is the identity that you want me to carry of you? That is what this question was aimed as. And I didn't really have an answer to this question. And not having an answer to this question put me in a state of conflict, like I said, where I knew what this question means, but I did not know how to answer this question. It isn't because I do not know what pronouns I want to be addressed as. And but what this question does is it opens a plethora of all other questions. For example, what is the language that exists in my head? What pronouns would I want to be addressed with underscores what pronouns do I address myself as. And I would use he, or I would use she, or I would use they, and I'm okay with each and any of them based on what I am feeling in that very moment, but also what is the meaning that they espouse in the other person that is using them. So if for them to use a certain specific pronoun for me requires them to think of me in a certain manner, would suddenly put me in disarray or put me in a conflict with it. So that therein started this question and idea, then what is my gender identity really? Because identity is fundamentally so political and so social. Because when we ascribe an identity to ourselves, are we doing it for ourselves, or are we doing it because for the fact that when I have this identity, the other person is supposed to respond to me in a certain manner? And I began questioning, do I even have a gender identity? Or for me, is gender even an identity? And I realized that it really isn't. For me, gender is performative. For me, gender is liminal. For me, gender is a mood. I specifically am not really ever a man or a woman or a being that carries an identity related to a gender. I am a being who understands gender, who lives gender, who responds to gender, who knows what gender mannerisms I have to adopt or adapt in a given situation or given setting. I know when to be masculine or be the man. I know when I have to indulge in passivity and express femininity. So the term that I use these days to sum this question up, or like my answer up, is the term that I sometimes use these days is that I'm quantum gender. Because the only realm or the only epistemology, so as to speak, that I found somewhat relatable to my experience of gender was, quantum physics, where things there's never a definitive state. Things can alternate between two or more modes of existence, modes of being. And at any given point, you cannot really predict what it is. And if you predict what it is, then it means you've taken a snapshot of what it was at a certain given time. It means nothing for what it was before that moment or what it can be after that moment. And you can never really predict at any given point what it is going to be. And if you do, then it is something very specific. So I think that's the example that I wanted to give, to say how, for me, it is about rationalizing and giving sense and giving meaning to something, but also expecting that that meaning and that sense can be uprooted at any given point, because it's all unpredictable.
Absolutely. It's almost the best way to describe it in my own mindset is you understand the language, but you choose to realize that the language is just one form of expression. And the same thing with the labels that one uses. Are you a man? oh, is that truly my identity? What is your social construct of what that means?
Yeah,
It's not about you, it's about the other person. You know,
yeah.
how does it make them feel? Do they feel uprooted in their own ability to kind of make sense of it all? And then all of a sudden now you're on stage as a stand-up comedian in some cases, and you're joking about this and you're having a conversation about this, but you're doing it as a social lubricant to allow people to realize you need to think deeper. We need to go into the depths and understand what really makes up this notion of identity. What impact does this truly have? Because our whole life is based upon how we think of ourselves, the way we eat, the way that we pray, the way that any form of ism that one has. But we don't even spend an ounce of that moment actually just considering, is this identity that I have truly mine? Or is it based upon me? So when you said about this historical context, what do you mean by that? Because it's saying uprooted. Historically, this isn't my identity. We're misinformed, misaligned with who we think we are and what we've become.
And I think that goes to what it means to be Pakistani and what it means to be South Asian. And the political weight again and the political baggage of that statement. Again, because identity isn't just a description, it also carries weight with itself, and it carries a burden of expectations. So when I define myself as Pakistani, do I acknowledge everything that comes along with it? Am I a Paki? You know, if I have to relate it in terms of how British South Asians often feel and are often labeled. And what is the baggage and the weight that being a Paki essentially carries? You're constantly made aware of how this particular identity is consumed. It is represented. Very interestingly, it's also how whenever you are scrolling through Pakistani social media or reading a Pakistani state's narratives of representation of what they classify as appropriate and inappropriate is often boxed in this definition of whether is it promoting a positive image of Pakistan. That's literally a statement that the Pakistani government often uses, that we want to call upon artists who promote a positive image of Pakistan, which introduces a form of normativity of what it is that is positive and what is that is negative, and who gets to decide it. So it's essentially basically just that question. So if Pakistan is poor and I'm a poor person as a result of being Pakistani, and poverty is bad, then am I to be blamed for my poverty as a Pakistani? Or are there other reasons for it? Should I blame my state? Should I blame my government? Should I blame the failure of social institutions? And if I have to blame any or either of those, or basically find a cause for my poverty, an explanation for it, how do I ignore history? Where is the history in all of this? If I was born in the exact same spot where I was born in 1991, instead of 1991, if I was born there in 1800, would I still be poor? If I was born there in 1947, would I still be poor? Or in 1900, at what point in time do I, or people like me, or people who were born in the same area as I am, started being poor? At what point did we started being Pakistani? What was I before that? And what are the possibilities that come after that? So this uprooting from history is basically all of that, because growing up in Pakistan, specifically in the 90s, which means that I'm a post-Zia generation. That is when military dictator General Zia-ul-Haq had taken over and had exercised a deliberate effort to Islamize Pakistan, or whatever that is supposed to be. And this is where we go back to, I want to trace back a little bit. Pakistan, at the end of the day, is a national identity. It's not a nationalist identity. And when I say national, I specifically mean an identity based on the idea of a country, of a nation state. That, okay, these are the boundaries, this is the flag, this is the constitution, this is the Milli Nagma, or the national anthem, and then you define it through it. But what does it really mean to be Pakistani? Because it meant nothing up until 14th of August 1947, or 13th of August 1947. And then from the 14th of August 1947, suddenly it had to mean something. But all the people living in what is now called Pakistan on the 15th of August 1947 still had identities. Now they had one more identity on top of that, which was the identity of being Pakistani. It didn't carry any meaning. The only meaning that it perhaps carried is that, okay, this is a label that is ascribed to us. We live in a certain geographic area, and this is the flag that we are now supposed to bow down to for honor. But it was a new identity nonetheless. There were other identities that existed alongside it. So what does it mean to be Pakistani has always been a question mark. And the struggle to answer this question, or the answer that is given to this question, has always been a political answer, because there has been contestation over it. Does being Pakistani mean that I am South Asian? Does being Pakistani mean that I am a Muslim or I am an Islamist? What is it? And this idea, this narrative of the Pakistani identity or the meaning of it, somebody has always tried to take ownership of it. Pakistan ka matlab kya? La ilaha illallah. Why did the need for this slogan emerge? Jamaat-e-Islami used the slogan. Ironic, because Jamaat-e-Islami was also a political Islamic party that opposed the creation of Pakistan in 1927. So this need to invent the meaning of Pakistan, where does it stem from and where does it come from? So you're constantly fed this growing up in Pakistan as a 90s child, as a child of the post-Zia generation, where the meaning of Pakistan and the meaning of being Pakistani is very narrow, very definitive, and consistently fed to you in very narrow means through the media and through the curriculum and through the books. And there's a group of people, and there are always dissident voices that basically see through it. They look at it, they consume it, they indulge in it, but eventually they see through it. They're like, okay, but there's more to it than this. So what's interesting is, when I was young, I remember we used to say that na Punjabi, na Baloch, na Sindhi, na Pathan, hum sab Pakistan. And नहीं मैंने तो ये नहीं करना क्योंकि हम इंडियन नहीं है, हम पाकिस्तानी हैं, या ये वाला काम मत करो क्योंकि इंडियंस ऐसे करते हैं, पाकिस्तानी ऐसे नहीं करते, बट पाकिस्तानी तो ऐसे कर रहे हैं, ये जो मेरे इर्द-गिर्द हो रहा है. So, these statements and these words that were uttered to me or uttered around me, I started analyzing them a little bit, and I figured out that, the way we are defining Pakistani is not by what Pakistani is, but what Pakistani isn't or can't be. And what it can't be is in relationship to what somebody else is. So our identity, the Pakistani identity that was being dictated to us, was fundamentally appositional. That, we are who we are by not being what the other is. And that meant rejecting it within yourself, or the intuitive cultural underpinnings that ask you or make you do things in a certain manner or think in a certain manner. Now you have to reject that. And that is, I guess, when a deep dive into history started that a lot of other people have also indulged in, where we look at the documented practice of divide and rule, where the idea of Muslim and Hindu as identities really didn't exist that definitively in many parts of South Asia. That the construction of the Muslim and the Hindu itself was a political exercise in colonialism. Because when you look at the ancient records of fights between, let's say, Mughals and the Marathas, they aren't really framed from a Hindu versus Muslim angle. That is a layer that is documented, that is a layer that is acknowledged, but it is predominantly that of invasion of the other.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And the idea of us is a people who live in a certain place, have ascribed value to that certain place, have a certain culture that they have value in, and have a sense of defensibility when it comes to their areas or their lands being attacked. And suddenly all of that is uprooted. Suddenly you are now the British colony of India that you are. And then there are multiple resistances that happen against it, and eventually they culminate into what we call independence. But here is the last and the final fun fact. We didn't just gain independence from the British. While gaining independence from the British, we also had to create a new identity, Indian or Pakistani, the nation state. So suddenly being independent from the British now also means being Pakistani or being Indian, but I have never really felt that. We have never really been given that. Being Pakistani has never really meant being rooted in a historical struggle to regain control of our lands from the foreign. What has been told to us or dictated to us has been a struggle to regain control of our lands from the Hindu. But the area where I am and where I belong to, there weren't really a lot of Hindu people there, ever. It was always under what we now conceptualize as the Muslim rule. Muslim people have been the majority. So whom did we really seek independence from? And if, let's just come down to the last fact, if we actually really did gain independence from the British, what does that mean? What did we gain independence from? What aspect of our lives were really under control? So when I say that I have to examine myself in a historic context and a historic relationship, it is all of these questions that I'm asking right now.
Why do you feel people don't take that deep dive?
Because people aren't allowed to take that deep dive. It doesn't really exist. The examination of colonization as a narrative is something that we land upon after a lot of eliminations, after a lot of thought experiments and historical readings. People like myself who have the practice of, let's say, indulging in historical readings and whatnot and finding the meaning of things. For a lot of other people, this meaning isn't really that definitive. I'm pretty certain if you take a poll in Pakistan, take a camera and a microphone and just go to people on the day, or let's say on 14th of August, when the country is celebrating Independence Day, and go ask people, hey, whom did we gain independence from? And maybe some people will answer British. My assumption is that a lot of other people will answer India. They will assume that we took independence from India. That is how they. So people will have a confusing answer to that question. But even if they're saying British, and you ask them, well, what is it that you really mean by the fact that we gained independence? How were we not independent? How were we not free? They wouldn't really have an answer, and that's because it is not discussed. It is not taught to us. We don't bring it up. And my experience with it and my sense making of it is, of course, rooted in where specifically I am from and why it isn't really discussed over there. And I think the reason for that is that we were colonized for a good 90 years directly, but there was a lot that was happening before that as well. And during this colonization, multiple generations were born, at least two. And by the time the third generation was born, which is what I would call my father was born in 1947. All these generations, they were just focused on survival. They weren't focused on thriving, because a generation or a group of people who are living in an area have their own narratives, and there's meaning that they've given to their lives, to the agriculture that they do, or to the animals that they rear, or whatever their cultural practices of money making are, is suddenly all uprooted. Suddenly you can't be that anymore. That has gone away. And now you have to give a new meaning to your life. And it's not an easy task, giving meaning to your life.
No.
A lot of people have been unable to do so just because of COVID-19. I will give that example. How the lockdowns literally threw the whole global culture in disarray. Suddenly people lost the sense of time and lost the meaning of what it means to be themselves, because their idea of who they were was based on what they do daily, what their daily routine.
Absolutely. It's all autopilot, isn't it? And now all of a sudden you've had this chance, great opportunity to reflect and say, well, what makes me me? What makes me think the way that I do? And now what do I do with this precious time that I have left? And then that's the thing that I find really inspirational about what you're saying as well, is actually we will do everything in the sense of identity. Do we truly understand what identity means? And a geographical location, politically, yes, it would be termed Pakistan or India, but that is literally lines across a border, with a flag put on there. If we look at it just in the economic sense, policies, everything else is created, but that is it. What we subscribe to that feeling is now down to us, but it should come from within, not something that will be a political jargon that is forced upon you. And that's why you can never subscribe yourself as a nationalistic identity. Because even
Yeah,
nationalism in itself is going to be subject to change every 5 years, depending on what the
absolutely.
political statement is.
Mhm.
It's
Specifically in the case of Pakistan, where the idea of being that Pakistani or that idea of nationalism is very dictated.
yeah. What's your biggest fears?
Sorry?
What are your biggest fears?
Oh, my biggest fear is, I guess, not being able to find peace in my head. Or, but my biggest fear is basically the absence of a feeling rather than a presence of feeling. And it's a feeling that I live with, that is where there's an underlying comfort or an underlying faith in myself to be able to find meaning, find purpose, and even if I don't, then being able to understand it and make sense of it, um, and and the and this faith in myself that I'm able to read the emotionality of a time, a place, an interaction. This is this like side of myself that I never really understood as a child. I still think I don't really fully understand this aspect of myself. And it used to drive me mad trying to give it a name or trying to find reason for it. This ability to, when I'm engaging in a conversation with someone and we are physically connected, as in we are sitting right in front of each other, or when I go into a space where there are people, it can be a historical site, it can be a vacation, it can be a room that I enter. I'm usually able to gauge or sense the mood or the emotionality of that space or that person or that conversation. And I was always unable to really pinpoint it. What is it? What is the sense that I have? Is it a sixth sense? Is it intuition? Am I crazy? Am I projecting things? Up until I landed upon the word empath. And
Empathy,
that
yeah.
is the word that I use now because I think that's the word that makes more sense to me. So it's like losing that sense. That would be my biggest fear.
Because that would mean what? You lose sense of identity, you lose sense of connection to the world, connection to
Yeah,
others.
yeah, that means that I lose this very core aspect of myself that I have knowingly and unknowingly relied on for a lot of my passive information. Because if I have to make sense of things, I don't just always sit down and rationalize. I'm also a very experiential and a very sensory being. For me, the sensory aspect of things and the experiential aspect of things is very important. And of course, it's governed by what meaning I give to things and all. But this one that I'm talking about specifically is purely limbic. It's purely experiential, like I
I
said.
think you're subconsciously competent in that
Hmm,
area because it's
hmm,
natural. I think there's two types of people. You see the world as you are, or you see the world as it is. To see the world
hmm,
as it is means that you have to determine what are the layers that make me up as a person. So therefore, I
hmm,
can filter that. I
hmm,
think that's the fact that what you've done. But what's really interesting is that what you experience is the same experiences that everybody else has. I think maybe it's part of the fragility that is being a human being. The
hmm,
difference is you're actually vocalizing it and you're being
hmm,
very open and honest, saying, actually, this is how, and again, it's nothing to do. And what I like of it is nothing to do with your sexuality. It's nothing to
hmm,
do with your identity in terms of, am I man or woman? It's saying, as a person, as a human being, as a species on this planet that has the availability to speak and talk and look and move, this is what's it like to be me.
hmm.
And therefore, I think that will resonate with a lot of people out there. Like, are you defined by the media in South Asia just purely on your gender, do you think now? Or have people now gone across that to say, actually, no, Moiz in himself is a being, and as a being, this is that form of entertainment, my form of expression to the world. Like, what's it like in that sense?
Yeah, I think it's always going to be that you are always defined by um, you're always defined within a, a larger meta construct of things, right? Like gender, nationality, identity, type of content that you're producing, because that's how media works. You have to have a digital identity or a media identity. Uh, if you don't define it, your audience defines it for you by virtue of who it is. And in today's world and age, where all media is also governed by artificial intelligence, that is algorithms on Facebook and Twitter, even if you don't indulge in it yourself, the system will do it for you by who are your videos or your content recommended to? How does the recommender system work on your specific content? So do you define it yourself, or do you allow the algorithm to define it for you? Do you allow your audience to define it for you? So I don't, of course, leave it that open-ended, because I recognize the importance of it. And I also recognize that if I do not set it, then somebody else will. And that somebody else can be a group of people, a collective of people. It can be a passive exercise, not that people are actively indulging in, but as a result of the 505,000 people who are indulging in my content, the recommender system might box or ascribe certain identity labels or values to my content.
You just said something there for me, which is remarkably scary, is the fact that there is an algorithm. The algorithm is human made, that we place within, obviously, the machinery of the context, but it's human behavior to categorize, because it's easy, it's lazy, it's a knee-jerk reaction for us to do that.
Yeah.
And as people that are consuming content, they need to be aware of that is the power that be. You have a choice of what you do that on, but you have to look beyond that. Sorry, it's just a side note to this expression of yourself, but I think it's important to realize that need to categorize is now being forced upon people rather than you actually doing it. So that secondary nature that we had, that we did it on our own lens, is now being put forward. So yeah, you've recognized the fact that people have this need. And so do you feel that you, rather than fighting against it, you're working with it just to help people explore it further then, I guess? And that's kind of what your content does, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, there's like an impact, there's like an effect of the content, but often at times we misconstrue impact as intention. We assume that the impact, or whatever impact of the content is visible, is also precisely what the intention behind that content was. And I don't necessarily operate on that or agree with that, because that also presumes 100% efficiency on behalf of the content creator or the artist. You know, this is what the artist intended, and wow, this is exactly how the audience is responding to it. And this is quite interesting what you just mentioned, how you described how the content that is recommended to us is also coming through an algorithm, and being vigilant about it and being aware of it. And it somehow reminded me of Westworld, and how when Dolores or Maeve became aware of the larger matrix or the larger system that they were a part of. It's like when a chess piece realizes that it's a chess piece on a chessboard, which means that there is something that is non-chess, and there is a world outside of the chessboard as well. And it is the same thing when I talk about examining myself in the historicity of things, is me being aware of the larger meta that governs my state of being, that has contributed to who I am and where I am and how my life has been, and what aspects of it were outside my control. And then I think being human just fundamentally becomes an exercise in what all can you regain control over.
Yeah.
So my act, my drag, and also my Shumaila Bhatti, and then also my non-humorous, non-comedic content, such as this podcast and the many other podcasts that are available online, and the talks that I've had, and the panel talks that I've had, wherein I talk about gender and sexuality and homosexuality, and the invention of homosexuality and heterosexuality, and all of those things, and the inherent queerness of the South Asian Sufi identity, and all of those things. When I speak about them, of course, there is an intention, there is a purpose. And the purpose is the creation of a meaning. Because if being Pakistani or being South Asian carries political weight and carries political baggage, A, which we recognize, and B, we recognize that the meaning of this identity is dictated actively by certain authorities and certain people or artifacts of power but also passively through how the media does it, then C, the last question really becomes, am I going to take ownership of it? If this identity is a constructed artificial identity, and the meanings that are being given to this identity aren't coming from me or people like me, the ones that I see in the mainstream, but historically speaking, they have. Should I reclaim it? Should I regain control of it? If being me or thinking like me is un-Pakistani, and I repeat that, am I fundamentally agreeing with the value system that is being proscribed by the mainstream or the status quo? Or am I going to use this uniqueness of myself and the uniqueness of my thought process as a flag bearer, as a hallmark, or as an example of the fact that this is also what it means to be Pakistani?
Absolutely. You get to subscribe what it means. And if you choose to use a national identity, you can. But bearing in mind, a national identity is a blanket statement, just a group of people together for a economic or diplomatic means. It shouldn't define who you are as a person.
So what it boils down to for me is, eventually, that while being aware of all of these things, that of course, when I create content, it is in a certain media universe that is governed by certain laws and principles. It is consumed by people who are governed by certain laws and principles. It is dictated to other people based on algorithms that follow certain laws and principles. What is the outcome that I really want from all of this? And that's where I realize that for me, it's just, and by saying it's just, I'm already kneecapping my statement, but for me, it's regaining or putting in an attempt to regain control of how the narrative is written.
Yeah.
About what it means to be South Asian,
Absolutely.
what it means to be Pakistani, what it means to be queer, and what it means to be a human at all 4 levels. That is basically what my content and what my art and what my performance essentially becomes about. And as I'm doing it, I'm going to be aware of the larger system and the larger laws and rules and regulations of meaning making and sense making and identity that govern it, with the intention, a very conscious intention of queering it. And this
what does that mean?
Yeah.
Queering it.
Yeah, I would love to answer that. Because then, as a result of this, queering becomes an exercise rather than an identity. And this identity becomes a result of an exercise that you indulge in. And what being queer and what queering essentially means to me is just like Westworld, being like Dolores and Maeve, understanding the matrix that you're in, understanding the rules and the laws and the policies, the dictum that basically governs your existence. At a larger level, you can zoom in on it at any focus level as well, like talking about you as the professional, talking about you as the man, or about you as the husband, or you as the artist. In any realm, you can look at it, but I'm just explaining the larger meaning of it, what it is essentially. But looking at the laws and the policies and the dictum, the matrix that governs it, the meta that governs it, identifying how did it come into being, and then choosing to indulge in it when it is beneficial for you, and having the power to flip it entirely and live outside those rules as it seems fit.
So what do you define as queering then? Are you saying that it's giving you the breadth of intent and expression to say it can go against the norm? Is that what?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely that. And by going against the norm, both as a rebellious exercise, it can mean that as well, and also as a non-rebellious exercise, simply a rejection.
See, that's really interesting. So being queer, is that an identity?
Yes, being queer is an identity.
Why?
But it's an identity of emergence.
Okay,
it's not an identity that you're born with or anything. That's where I disagree with. And for me, the identity queer then encapsulates a lot of different things. If you're a girl, let's say in contemporary Pakistan, who does not want to marry the guy of her parents' choice, and who wants to be an engineer, and this is outside the dictum of what the feminine gender states of the idea of being a woman, then you're queer.
The feminine agenda dictates based upon social norms. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then you're
Yeah.
seeing being opposite.
So
Yeah.
if you are in opposition to a certain policy or a certain rule uh, which has been pushed on you based on an identity that has been given to you or that is your own, that is a man or a woman or a doctor or an engineer, think of it like this. When people say, this is not how a good man behaves or a good woman behaves or a good doctor behaves. So this idea of virtue and this idea of goodness and badness and what you should indulge in, being incongruent with it, it's causing a certain level of dissonance. And
That's
you
really
may know,
interesting. So that's what you define as queer.
yes,
You're saying that it's a void of any form of perceived sexuality. It's saying you have a choice and you can go against the dictum of what society is saying. And
yeah,
because you're redefining that notion, then
yeah,
it enables more people to say, regardless of what you may think of sexuality or whatever it is, if you're on this side, that means you're with us. It's
yeah,
not about, and that's a powerful statement to make, because now all of a sudden, I suppose, because of a lot of the mediums, it's been painted as, and it's on all sides. You're either on the left or you're on the right. But what you're saying is this is not about sexuality. It's saying, do you want to give yourself the bandwidth of creative personal expression? And do you recognize that your identity should be made by yourself and not enforced upon you as a knee-jerk reaction? And if you believe in that, then that means you're joining our movement.
yeah.
And there'll be a lot of people that would be homosexual, but they doesn't mean that they're necessarily part of a queer movement, because they're also
Absolutely.
allowing themselves to be defined as a certain personality. Because they're doing that, you'll say, well, sexuality alone doesn't get you into this group. It's
Yeah.
a shift in mindset. So therefore,
Yeah.
now you belong on the other. That's fascinating.
Yeah, and it stems out from the origin of the word queer itself. And I think it's a great way, it's a great podcast to be talking about it, because the word queer also came out of the British culture. So the word gay didn't really exist. It's just that men and women who were living in Victorian era England and whose
Absolutely.
lives
Yeah.
were governed by Victorian era norms of gender and morality looked at some men, and they were like, oh, that person's queer. Look at him, how queer,
How unique, how different, but how
right?
queer. Yeah.
And how in Punjabi we call it vakra,
Yeah.
ajeeb.
But by the way, I do like your English accent there, Moiz. It's very Mary Poppins like, just to let you know. A bit more
I
Dick
love
Van
Mary
Dyke, but
Poppins. Yeah.
I'll let that pass. But no, you're right. If we look at the actual definition of the word, what we ascribe to it is very different from
Yeah.
what it's turned into
And
now.
it was quite a negative word. It carried a lot of negative connotations. So when this emerged, when the movement emerged, the queer movement, it was essentially that. It was a reclamation. And you can find similarities in modern day as well. For example, in 2000 and something, I forgot, it was 2010, I think it was 2010, when there were the slut walks in Chicago, based on what behaviors women had to experience in the subway. And if they ever reported it, they were said, oh, well, you're a slut. Or like, it's how you are dressed. That's why men behave with you in a certain manner. And specifically, it happened because a woman was raped, and one of the prosecutors, somebody made the statement that, well, stop dressing like a slut and you won't be raped. And that's when women all came out on the street and they said, well, all of us are sluts then. These are slut walks. That is when you own an identity simply because you understand the baggage that it carries, and you're owning it and you're reclaiming it, not because you agree with it, but because you're using it as a fuck you, to push it in somebody else's face. It's just like when in Pakistan there is the Aurat March, the Women's March. The anti-feminists and the patriarchs lose their shit. And there was this very beautiful placard that a woman held. It said, "Haan main badchalan, haan main avara." Because it was a reclamation. It was a recognition of the fact that badchalan and avara, which basically means, a woman of loose character, blah, blah, blah. You understand what I'm trying to say? That realm of the idea of bad femininity and a bad woman. She's recognizing, this woman and this movement and this group of people are recognizing that this is not an identity. This is a label that is given to you to make you feel a certain manner. that the production of this term, slut, badchalan, avara, randi, gashti, all of these terms are not devoid of context. They are given to us as a punishment. They are a penalty. It is told to us that you can't be it, and that if you are behaving in a certain manner, then you are it. And society tells me that I shouldn't be it, and nobody should be it.
And
It being all of these labels.
And society is based upon the rumors and gossips of others that we start to believe over and over again.
And society is based on the larger level meta laws on gender that we all know, that we all abide by or choose to not abide by sometimes, often being acritical of them, not recognizing them at all. So being queer means to be like Dorothy and Maeve in Westworld, being aware of the larger meta system that is present, and then choosing whether you want to be a part of it or not want to be a part of it, or you want to rebel against it, or not rebelling against it.
Yeah.
This is what I'm saying. So then, this is what being queer is, but then queering is also a practice. Because you see, it is mental exercise that one has to indulge in. And this is what undoes the identity-based idea of LGBTQI politics of the West, of the politics of hashtag born this way. And this is not my choice. I have always been averse to that idea because, yes, I like it. This idea that identity-based politics, well, people are helpless. They are this way. They can't really help it. It evokes a sense of sympathy, a sense of pity. Oh, the poor gays, they were born this way. Let us allow them to have sex with each other. Whereas for me, being queer is not, well, my rights are not for you to give me. My right to be me fundamentally underscores that I do not have to explain my existence to you. Because if we are going to work on the notion of equality, on the paradigm of equality, then if I have to explain myself, you have to explain yourself too.
Absolutely.
So for me, being queer, that means that if I have to explain what caused my queerness, then you have to explain what caused your non-queerness as well. If I'm going to be asked a question, well, when did you realize that you were attracted towards men? I'm going to ask, well, when did you realize that you were not attracted to men? So this is that. Everything that we ask of queer people or of LGBTQ people or whatever identity label that we are indulging in, if you take that question or take that list of questions and you remove the queer identity and plug in the non-queer identity, think of a list of questions that you would ask gay people or people ask gay people. Take the word gay out of it and put the word straight in there. That is my queerness.
Which is, for me, personally, is the way that it should be. And I think that's where I think that's where you've had this issue, this collision. Because ultimately in the US, it's really weird, isn't it? Because you got the Western world that's been leading the fight and the battle for equality, who have actually got it incredibly wrong. Because what we've turned a lot of movements into is virtue signaling. We're not happy, we're going to march through the streets. We're going to take it back. Take back what? What's already yours?
Yeah.
No, we're going to redefine who we are. In what way? By putting a label on there to say, I'm not like you, I'm the other, rather than saying, actually, we're all the same. I just choose this. And that's what I think is really interesting about what you do, your work, and how this podcast is formed, because it's saying, actually, we just all have to take a step back as a community of human beings and actually ask ourselves the deeper questions. We cannot be defined by a sexuality. That's crazy. You might as well try out cyanide tasting if you think that's common sense, right? You can't be defined by a gender because there's a lot of baggage in and around that. And what that means, you only subscribe to either man or okay. What, that's your whole life?
Yeah.
Your life on this planet is going to be based upon that. And I also like the idea that you can't be ascribed by a nationalistic form of identity that you have no input to. So what, you just want to sit there and take it. That's it.
Absolutely. And if that nationalistic identity does not have room for me, then I will create room.
Absolutely.
Because I am in that room. So the identity, it means that I don't have room in an identity, is false. Because the identity is your own. It's for your own creation. And if you
Absolutely.
exist and you espouse that identity, then you are fundamentally a part of it.
What a fantastic conversation. I'm sure you agree. Not only did we plunge in pretty deep, but there's so much to back this. As you can tell, Moiz has done a lot of research and he knows his stuff inside out. It's refreshing, isn't it? As a community, as people, global Indians, the movement that we're creating that goes regardless of national identities, regardless of any forms of ism, that we can actually sit back and create a safe mooring ground for these remarkable conversations. And that's thanks to you. So look, what I like to do is say this. If you like the work that we do, if you like what we're about, it's easy to support, share and comment on your area that you listen to this on. Because with your help and your shares, we get to build a living encyclopedia of people just like us. And before I bid you a wonderful week ahead, I'll leave you with one final message from our dear supporters. I hope you enjoy this session and take care for now.
Hello, my name is Daniel Trasa, and I'm dean of one of Europe's leading business schools, the Nova School of Business and Economics in Carcavelos, Portugal. 100 years ago, my grandfather left India looking for opportunities, looking to discover the world, and to make an impact. I welcome you to listen to the incredible conversations via these podcasts that are defining who we are as a diaspora. How Indians like my grandfather and its descendants have made a change, a difference, an impact in the world. On behalf of our faculty, the staff and students at Nova School of Business and Economics, I hope you're staying safe, staying curious, staying global, and really looking to build a better world. Thank you.